Hello and welcome to this tutorial. Today we're going to spend some time looking at layers and what they are. So let's begin. Keep in mind I'm going to be using Photoshop CS3. However, you may have a newer or older version of Photoshop. Your user interface may look slightly different, but the difference shouldn't be too great and you'll still be able to follow along with what I'm doing. So first we're going to look at what layers are and why they're so important when you use them in Photoshop. We're going to walk through the layers panel, and we're also going to take a look at the layers menu at the top of the screen. So to get started, we're going to look at what layers are and why they're so important. Layers are just that, layers. They're separate workspaces that you can use whenever you're editing an image in Photoshop. Each layer is independent from all the other layers, so whatever you do to one single layer won't affect other layers. And this is important when you have a bunch of effects on one single image and you want to be able to edit each one individually. So let's get started with a demonstration of layers. First, we're going to hop to the layers panel in the bottom right of my screen. You'll notice that I only have one layer right now. To really show the potential of layers, I'm going to create 2 more layers. Okay, now we have 3 layers to work with. You'll notice that there's a checkerboard pattern as the background of my image. Image editing software uses this pattern to show transparency in the layer. And you'll see what I mean in a second. I'm just going to paint some shapes onto each individual layer, and I'm going to use different colors for each one. Starting with layer 1, I'm going to paint a circle. A rough circle. Okay, and then on layer 2, I'm going to paint a red triangle. And on layer 3, I'm going to paint a blue square. Okay, now we have 3 separate shapes on 3 different layers. When you look at the preview of the image, you can't really tell that the shapes are on different layers. When you look at the layers panel, you can tell that all 3 shapes are on different layers. Now what's the benefit of having them on different layers? Well, say I wanted to hide the red triangle. All I have to do is click the eye icon and it disappears. If all 3 shapes were on the same layer, I'd have a harder time hiding just one single shape. Thus, having them on separate layers gives you more control over what you want to do with each individual shape. Also, layers are stacked on top of each other. So in this case, you can see layer 1 is at the bottom and layer 3 is at the top. Layer order is very important when you have several different items that you want to overlap. Now, depending on the layer order, certain objects will overlap other objects. Now in this case, no shapes are actually overlapping. That's because they all have their individual space on my canvas here. If I move the triangle on top of the circle, you can tell that the triangle overlaps the circle. And then if I move the square over both of them, you can tell that the square overlaps both of them. That's because the square is the topmost layer, and thus it hides anything underneath it. And since the circle is at the bottom, it will be overlapped by both the square and the triangle. The triangle, being the middle layer, will only be overlapped by the square and will overlap the circle. Now if I place all of these shapes on top of each other, and then I change the layer order. Now you can change layer order just by dragging the layers up and down on your layers panel. If I move layer 3 to the bottom, you'll see that the circle, well, you can't tell, but the circle and triangle overlap the square. It's sort of like a sandwich. The circle ends up at the top and the square is at the bottom. Now no matter what you do to these layers, and their order, you can see that the shapes will change depending on the order of the layers. And this is really helpful when you want to stack different shapes on top of each other and create interesting effects. And now you can get a feel of what transparency is as well. If I move this square to the side, you'll notice that all around the square is this checkered background, which represents transparency. Now usually in an image you'll start with a white background, but in this case I got rid of that and it's transparent. So that means when I move the square over the other two shapes, anything around the square is transparent. It displays the layers below it. For example, around the square, instead of seeing white, for example, you can see the black circle and you can see the red triangle. And that's the beauty of transparency. You can show what's behind your actual shape on each layer. It may be a bit confusing to understand, but once you play around with it, you'll get a feel for it yourself. You can imagine each layer as a glass pane, and then whatever isn't painted or whatever isn't on the glass pane, you can see through. And that's it basically for how layers work. And I hope you understand why these are really important, because each individual layer is independent from other layers. I can delete layer 3 and it won't affect layer 1 nor layer 2. I can delete layer 2 and layer 1 will still be there. And I can move each individual layer around by itself. Now for a couple of examples. So here's one example of using layers. In the background here I have a space stock of Earth. It's an artist's impression. Now say I want to add a couple of effects to this to make it look more interesting. Well, I could start painting a bunch of effects onto the actual stock, but what would happen if I made a mistake? Let's take a look. I'm going to paint some random blue lines all around Earth. And notice this is on layer 1, the actual layer which has our actual stock on it. Now, I painted these blue lines and I decided, hey, they don't look too great. So, how do I get rid of them? Well, here's the problem. When I start erasing this blue line, I erase the whole image. I'm erasing the stock as well as the blue line, which I don't really want. And in this case, we lose the actual stock's background, and that isn't good at all. So how do we prevent this? Well, let me undo these. Okay. Now we're back to square one. Now how do we prevent this mistake problem? Well, I can start painting these effects on a new layer. So if I use my brush tool and I paint on layer 2, same lines, and I decide, hey, I don't like these anymore. Well, I can just delete layer 2, or I can hide layer 2 by clicking the eye icon. And you can notice that it doesn't affect the original stock. So that's the beauty of a layer. And then since this layer is transparent, anything that isn't painted on it won't show. So then it just goes right through to the layer behind it. And then you can get anything you want on layer 2 to show as a whole image. And if you decide you don't like what you just did, you can just delete layer 2 and everything's gone and you didn't harm layer 1 at all. So that's what I find really useful about layers. And you'll find that layers are really useful yourself when you use Photoshop in the future. So that's it for how layers work and why they're really important. Next we're going to go through the layers panel. So now we're going to take a look at the layers panel in the bottom right of my screen. The layers panel gives you an overview of all the layers you have in your image. Here I have 3 layers with 3 separate images on each one. The layers panel also lets you change the blending mode of your layer. It gives you a bunch of options and we'll look at these in later tutorials. You can also change the opacity of your layer and also the fill percentage of your layer. They're really similar and I usually just stick with opacity. And also at the bottom of your layers panel, you have a bunch of little icons here. The ones I find most useful are create a new layer and delete layer. The other icons are create a new group, adjustment layers, and add a layer mask, and also layer styles. Now creating a group is just that. Creating a group gives you a folder in which you can place a bunch of layers into. For example, here I place layer 2 and layer 3 in the same group. Now when I have group 1 selected and I'm using the move tool, I'm actually moving layer 2 and 3 together. And that's the beauty of groups. You can group a bunch of things that you want to stay together or move together. And also whatever you do to a group will be applied to every single layer inside the group. If I hide the group, every single layer is hidden. Next we have adjustment layers, and these we'll go over in the next tutorial, and create a layer mask, which are a bit more complex. And finally we have layer styles, which is the same thing as double clicking the layer and getting your layer style options. Next we're going to take a look at the layers menu. The layer menu is found at the top of your screen, next to all the other menus we went through during the last tutorial. I don't use the layer menu that much because most of the options in the layer menu can be found in the layers panel, and I tend to use the layers panel much more. So here you can create a new layer, duplicate layers, delete layers. You can access the layer styles, which you can also find at the layer panel. Fill layers and adjustment layers I'll go over later. Now these 3D layers and video layers, you probably won't use these too often. And that's pretty much it here. Merging layers and whatever. For merging layers I just tend to remember the keyboard shortcut and it just goes from there. To be honest, I don't like the layer menu that much. It isn't really that helpful to me. I don't know if you'll find it helpful, but for me I just tend to stick with the layers panel. And that's it for this tutorial. Thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe if this helped you in any way. Stay tuned for this Thursday when the next tutorial is going to come out, and in that tutorial we're going to take a look at adjustment layers and also layer styles in further detail. We might also take a peek at differences between raster layers and vector layers, and we also might take a look at filters. So that's it. Thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe.